Adnan Abu Hasna is a UN worker near that border. Adnan, lots of confusion whether people will be able to use the crossing at Rafah. And as we do this interview, it's almost 10 p.m. on Sunday. What's happening there now?
Nothing happened like now. Rafah crossing point is closed. Nothing is allowed in Gaza. No humanitarian corridor for aid at all.
For the people who are still in Gaza, how would you describe their situation?
It is a disaster. It is a catastrophe, actually. Nearly 1 million Palestinians, they fled. And look, there is no fuel, water. People are drinking dirty waters. It's about, death and life now.
Have you talked to anybody who is staying in the northern part of Gaza despite Israel's warnings to leave? Have you been in contact with any of them?
Yes, yesterday I was there, actually. I was in Gaza City. So I met some people, there. Some of them, they left their homes and they went, actually, to the southern part of Gaza. They find out that the shelters are full of displaced people. So they decided to go back to their homes. And others, say that they cannot leave their homes. They believe that it is like exodus, and it is the second Palestinian Nakba since 1948. So they prefer to stay and to bear, the consequences.
Tonight, do you see any hope in this situation?
There is no choice. Either, to let Gaza people die or to let the fuel, food, medicine to get into Gaza. And I think that the international community will not allow that to happen.
Okay, Adnan, thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Adnan Abu Hasna is with the UN's relief agency in Gaza. As we just heard, some living in northern Gaza are choosing to stay, and that is an increasingly dangerous situation as Israeli troops are expected to move with a ground offensive fairly soon. Let's bring in Scott Clancy for this part of the story. Scott's a retired Major General with the Canadian Armed Forces. And let me start with this. Once Israeli forces move in, they're going into a densely urban setting. Describe for us some of the challenges they're about to face.
Well, that's a great question to be able to contextualize this for Canadians. Very close terrain is how we in the military would term that, so that the buildings form their own mountains, if you will, except that people can shoot right down onto the troops that are moving along the ground, and you have to clear up into each one of those buildings, and you don't have long sight lines for your weapons. So that the benefits of modern weaponry, precision at standoff, where you can stand beyond where someone can reach out and hurt you, those things don't exist. So that's going to be a very tough street by street, room by room slog. And the Hamas is going to further complicate this by being amongst the civilian population and not identifying themselves as, militants until the last second. So they'll ambush and they'll use whatever devious things they can, to include countermanding the laws of war, to be able to kill the Israeli Defense Forces.
And what does that mean for the safety of civilians, the role of Israeli soldiers, if you can't immediately discern between combatants from Hamas and ordinary civilians?
That's going to be a very close dance. And I think the Israeli Defense Forces, one of the reasons why they paused here, initially it was a ultimatum to get out within a few number of hours, and now it's turned into conditions based, as the civilian population leaves. And I think we're seeing more people leave northern Gaza and not heed Hamas's directive to stay put. I think that's telling as to how serious civilians are taking this pending invasion. But what that means is that they're going to be deliberate. And if the Israeli Defense Forces are more deliberate, then they'll be able to delineate between that which is a threat. An armed person is a threat. An unarmed person, on the balance of things, you consider them to be a civilian until they pose a specific threat. Now, there's ways to get around that. Hamas is going to use those ways, and that's going to cause casualties for the Israeli Defense Forces. Everybody has to realize that's the cost of urban warfare against a terrorist organization.
And I guess adding a level of complication to this already difficult urban warfare is tunnels. Hamas says that, or at least the reports of Hamas using tunnels to hold hostages, to move weapons. And I think they've claimed that they're going to pop up out of those tunnels at any time and use those in trying to repel the Israeli forces.
And I think you're right. I mean, the aspect of tunnels adds yet another dimension. In warfare like this, we do consider everything like the three dimensions. We talked about the buildings up, but it's also the subterranean architecture that goes down. And you'll fight in and around that subterranean architecture, whether it's sewers or tunnels. The Israelis will use whatever technology they can to try and divine where those tunnels are. And Hamas will use them even just to explode underneath armored columns and troops. So it's not just to pop up behind and ambush, but also to take life to the maximum extent that they can possible. So that will further complicate the Israeli Defense Forces fight.
The original 24-hour deadline from Israel to people living in Gaza to move out of the northern part of Gaza is long past. And you mentioned one of the reasons for the delay may have been to give ample time, more time for those civilians to move. Any other thing, anything else going on that might be explaining the delay here?
Sure. I think there's a few things that are causing that delay. The first one was that, now linked to that, I think that the Israeli government and the Israeli Defense Forces are now thinking through what the end state to this operation looks like in terms of the security situation, so that it can be controlled and predictable into the future, so that you can have a political situation at some points, at least a path towards some semblance of a political situation, and the basics of life and sustainment for the Palestinian people, but not before the security situation is resolved. But those factors will drive how they do operations. So pausing now means that they're thinking through the end state, so how their deliberate operations will be effective. Now, the second thing is I think they're leaving some time for diplomacy from the United States, from the other Arab nations with Hamas to try and liberate those hostages that are in Gaza. I think that's prudent of them to be able to do that. And the third thing is that, the United States has moved a second carrier strike group into the Eastern Med, the USS Roosevelt, and they have stated openly that, they have some of the best special forces operatives in the world, that it might be American forces that are freeing American hostages. And some of the time and space to perhaps enable those types of surgical operations is as well. And then lastly, I think that the humanitarian aspect is going to be front and center with the Israeli forces and the Israeli government. So I think they're going through the measures to try and open humanitarian corridors to enable the relief of the suffering of the Palestinian people, not Hamas, but the Palestinian people in Gaza.
Really nice having your analysis. Thank you very much.
You have a wonderful evening.
Retired Major General Scott Clancy is in Cobourg, Ontario tonight.